This is episode 1 in my Dream Kitchen Makeover series, and today
we're installing the kitchen floors, but these floors have a secret. Underneath those tiles is a heated cable grid that's going to keep those feet warm all winter long. This video is going to cover everything from surface prep to membrane installation to the electrical components needed for the Schluter Ditra Heat cable system. And after showing you how to actually install and wire up that heated cable system, I'm also going to show you how to tile the entire kitchen floor, how to grout all the grout lines, and how to seal everything up for a good quality installation. Thanks to Nitto Tire for sponsoring the video, and let's get into it.
So here's where this project starts. Here's kind of the before of the kitchen.
And if you had tiles in your kitchen before and you remove them, chances are you're gonna have some mortar stuck to the plywood subfloor like I did. I found this tool that basically hooks up to your angle grinder. You attach a shop vac and it grinds it off super easy when you compare it to how long it would take if you just tried to scrape it off. I'll link this tool down in the description because it probably saved me 3 hours.
Okay, now that we got the tile up, we can actually vacuum up the dust.
And the cleaner your subfloor is now, the better the underlayment is going to adhere in future steps, so take your time and also sink any nail heads that might be sticking up.
Okay, now we got to remove the dust. To remove the dust, I'm going to be using a slightly damp sponge. We'll start back here in the corner.
And you don't want your sponge super wet, you just want it damp enough to remove any dust that the vacuum didn't grab. And for my heated kitchen floor, I'm using the Schluter Ditra Heat system, and they have a bunch of different uncoupling membranes you can use, but I decided to go with the sheet version in peel and stick with the sound control and thermal break included. I started by dry fitting all of the sheets and making any cuts that I needed, like the one right here around the pole, and you can just mark the membrane and then cut it with some heavy duty scissors or a utility knife. It's really not too hard. And again, this is just a dry fit, so I didn't expose the adhesive backing. And before you get too far, it's a good idea to make sure at the end you're not going to have a little sliver. If you are, it makes sense to cut some of the width on that first row. And for any cuts, like I mentioned, you can use a straight edge and a utility knife or just some heavy duty scissors. It cuts pretty easy, so don't sweat it. And when it came to layout, I used one full sheet on one side and then I cut the other side, and then I tried to alternate each row so that I would stagger the joint and not have one long joint all the way down the length of the room. And after making this last notched cut at the back of the room, it's time to remove the plastic and actually attach the adhesive to the subfloor. But first, we're going to apply this Schluter primer to the plywood subfloor to give us the best possible adhesion between the membrane and the plywood subfloor. And we're just going to roll this over the plywood subfloor with a nap roller. No need to overthink this. And after applying it to the entire application area, we're just going to give it a few minutes to dry. And this is the sound of things getting pretty serious because we're about to permanently attach this membrane to the subfloor. And although this application is going to make it look like everything went super smooth and easy, it takes a lot of adjusting. Once you put down one side, it's going to stick in place, and then you're going to have to kind of take it off and adjust it and tweak it. So don't get frustrated if you have to pivot. It's pretty iterative to get it perfect, but I promise it's not too bad. It just takes a little bit of adjusting. And this sheet right here went over a vent, so after taking off the backing and getting it stuck in place, I took a utility knife and I just cut around the perimeter of that exhaust vent. And you might notice that numbered piece of painter's tape on each of the sheets, and I did that during the dry fit stage, so I knew exactly where each piece was gonna go during the actual adhesion process. So despite some of you thinking that everything I do is an afterthought, at least I tried to think ahead on this one. And I think you guys get the process for installing this membrane, so I'll speed through these, and here's a look at the last one going in. And then you just want to crank up some music and hit a little two-step to make sure that all of the sheets are firmly pressed into the plywood, and make sure that you're getting optimal contact so that they stay in place forever. Now that we have the membrane installed, it's time to install the Schluter Ditra Heat system, but first, we gotta run a couple tests before we actually install the cable. The first test is the conductor resistance test to make sure that the cable wasn't damaged after it was shipped. To run this test, we're first gonna see the factory resistance, which is 12.41 ohms. Then we're gonna set our multimeter to resistance or ohms. And then we're gonna take our hot and our neutral leads and we're gonna touch them to the actual cables here. So I got those touched. And as you can see, the resistance is around 12.6, which is pretty dang close to the 12.4 factory value, or within 10%, which is what we need. And this is easier with gator clamps, but I don't have those. Next, we're gonna check for continuity between the heating cable and the grounding braid. And if everything's correct here, you should get an OL, which is an overload, or an infinity symbol, meaning that they're not touching, which is what we want. And make sure you fill out the heating cable test log for warranty purposes. Now, despite doing a lot of electrical work on my own, I hired a licensed electrician to run a dedicated 120 volt, 20 amp service from my panel to my Ditra Heat thermostat location upstairs. One of these Romex cables is dedicated to the thermostat and the other one goes to an outlet. It's completely unrelated, so only focus on that one Romex cable going into the thermostat box. You're also going to want a piece of conduit, or a Smurf tube in this case, running from that box down to the floor, and that's going to be where the heating cables and the thermostat cables run from the floor up to the thermostat. And my electrician was nice enough to leave me this little pull cord here, so I just taped the cables to that string and pulled it up through the Smurf tube into the box. And after getting the heating cables up into the thermostat box, it's time to embed the factory lead cold splice. But before we do that, let's mark our cabinets. We need to know our cabinet locations because we want to maintain a 2-inch offset between any cabinets and the heating cables. I just used some painter's tape to mark the general outline for all of the cabinets that are going to be installed in my kitchen. Here are the main cabinets, and then I also have this little coffee bar cabinet towards the front of the kitchen. And now that I have all the cabinets masked off, I can install these cables and the cold splice with a higher degree of confidence that I'm not going to have a conflict. So this cold splice right here is where you take the electricity from your box and that's converted into heat energy as it goes through that splice, and we just need to cut out the membrane where the splice is going to be embedded because it's a little bit thicker than the cable, and if you don't cut out the membrane, it's going to stick up proud and present an issue when you go to install your tile. Now, if you want, you can use hot glue or something to hold that splice in place, but I didn't find that necessary, and now we're ready to start running our heating cable. Now, the heating cables and the membrane were designed so that the heating cables will snap right into place in between the rows in the uncoupling membrane, and there are just a few things to keep in mind as you're running this cable. As mentioned before, we want to be at least 2 inches away from any fixed cabinets, partitions, or walls, so make sure that you space the cable accordingly. When it comes to running the grid, you have a couple different options. One, you can do alternating 3-stud, 3-stud spacing as shown here. You can also do alternating 3-stud, 2-stud spacing as shown here, but you can't do alternating 2-stud, 2-stud spacing because that is not allowed. It'll cause the cables to overheat, so don't do that. And you also cannot cut these cables at all, so you need to make sure that you buy the right cable spool length depending on the size of your room. And Schluter has a page on their site that helps you to calculate this. I'll link all these materials and resources down below. For my kitchen, based on the spool length of cable I had, I found that an alternating 3-stud, 2-stud spacing worked best, but I figured that out after starting with a 3-stud, 3-stud spacing and having to tear it out and start over. So it's not a big deal if you make a mistake. You can just pull the cable out and start over. And as I'm showing here, you want the cable to be a minimum of 4 inches away from any forced air vent. And at this point, it's just a matter of completing the rest of the grid, making sure that you stay within your 3-stud, 2-stud, or 3-stud, 3-stud spacing. And you can use a grout float to help embed the cables. I didn't find that was super necessary for my application, but if you're doing a large area, this might help to save your fingers a bit. And as I got to the end of my cable here, you can see that I didn't have quite enough cable to maintain that 3-stud, 2-stud spacing, so I ended up being a little bit short. So I had to pull up the grid and then increase to a 3-stud, 3-stud spacing a little bit further back in order to get that cable all the way to the end in that corner. And with our heating cables installed, it's time to install our temperature sensors. It's recommended that you install the temperature sensors in the middle of the cable grid, but a minimum of 12 inches from the wall. We're going to go around 24 inches from the wall for our installation. And you also want to install the temperature sensor in the middle of the 3-stud spacing, as shown here. And although only one of these temperature sensors is going to get wired up to the thermostat, Schluter provides a backup temperature sensor that you're going to pull up that Smurf tube and you're just going to leave it coiled up in the back of the box in case you ever need it in the future. And with both of our temperature sensors installed and the cables run up through our box, we can rerun the conductor resistance and the continuity test that we ran earlier to make sure we had no issues during the install. So now that we have the membrane and the cables installed, it's time to install the tile, and I'm going with the 12x24 natural beige tile. That looks pretty good and also has pretty good traction, just like today's video sponsor, Nitto Tire. This past winter, I was basically skidding to my destinations. And after one look at my existing tire treads, it's easy to see why. So when Nitto Tire reached out about their new Terra Grappler G3s, I immediately said yes. And despite being pretty handy, installing tires on rims by hand with the wrong tools is absolutely brutal, and it's worth every penny to have this done by a mechanic. Although the Terra G3 is an all-terrain tire, it's definitely best suited for those who are going to be on the road the majority of the time. And obviously, you can't have new shoes with old laces. So So I had these TIS 565 wheels installed at the same time as the Terra Grappler G3s, and I think it looks pretty good. And because I'm doing a little bit of towing, I went with this LT model just because it's a little bit stronger and better for towing. I put about 5,000 miles on my truck since switching to the Terra Grappler G3s, and I'm more than satisfied with their performance. Combine that with a limited treadwear warranty being one of the best in its class, I highly recommend that you check out the Nitto Terra Grappler G3s if you're in the market for some new tires. So where the existing hardwood flooring meets the new kitchen tile flooring, I wanted to install a slope profile, but I got the wrong size. But after a little problem solving, I found that I could cut out the membrane directly underneath the profile, and by dropping the height of the profile just around 1/4 of an inch or so, I ended up being in much better shape. And ideally, this would have been installed on top of the membrane, but I think we'll be fine. And when it comes to planning out your tile layout, you really should use 33% offset spacing like this for large format tiles that are above 12 by 24. But the brick pattern, which is just a half cut on either side, the math works out perfectly in this application, where cutting one tile in half works on both sides, and the math is never this good, and when it is, we're gonna use it.
It's always a good idea to use a tape measure or SketchUp or something, or just to lay out the tiles to kind of see how everything's looking, see where you're gonna need to make cuts, and you wanna make sure that you're not gonna have small slivers on the width or at the front or back. So I like to put a few tiles out, figure out what I wanna do. At this point, I feel pretty good. Let's pick these up and start tiling. Okay, so starting off complicated, I'm gonna have to make a cut to get around this post right here. And I'm just gonna put my profile piece right here so I don't cut it at the wrong size.
And I'm just going to mark the cut locations using a pencil by moving the tile around and then intersect those lines with a carpenter square. And there are a bunch of different ways to cut tile, but for this project, I kept it simple and I'm just using my rigid angle grinder and a cutting wheel designed for tile and masonry. And after cleaning up this cornerstone tile, if you will, it's time to mix up the thin set, and I'm using Schluter All Set just because that goes with the warranty, and I followed the manufacturer's instructions on how to mix that. Now, to install the tile profile, I basically just applied a ton of thin set to that entire area, and as you can see, I taped off the hardwood flooring so I didn't get mortar where I didn't want it. Then I just pressed the tile profile into that thin set mortar, make sure everything was flush and where I wanted it, and now it's time to tile. For a 12-inch by 24-inch tile, like the type I'm installing here, I used a 1/2-inch square notch trowel, which is generally recommended for tiles this size. The trowel lines should go perpendicular to the tile's longest side, and I'm using these leveling spacers that I got from Amazon. I'll link them in the video description, and they're gonna help to minimize lippage between the tiles and make sure they're perfectly even. Additionally, it's a good idea to back butter the back of all the tiles using the flat side of the trowel, and this is just to make sure that you get the best bond possible between the tile and the membrane. And for these leveling spacers, you install them before you install the next tile, which makes sense intuitively. And I have plenty of tiling tips I'm going to share with you, but let's talk about this splice first. To tile over this, I'm first going to lift it up and put a little bit of mortar underneath it to kind of hold it in place, and then you're just going to apply thin set mortar right over top of it, just like you would for any other location on the membrane. Comb out your notches, back butter the tile, insert your spacers, and boom, you just tiled over the splice. Simple as that. And I am a extremely messy tiler, so I always keep an old toothbrush and a sponge around so I can clean out the grout lines and remove any thin set mortar before it dries. Trust me, it's easier to deal with it now. And the only semi-complicated part of this entire tile project was cutting around this vent, and I'll show you how I did that in just a second. And as I finish this row, you might be wondering why I left this walkway on the left-hand side, and I'll explain that in just a second. But first, I'm gonna mark the cuts around this air vent, mark the width, then mark the depth, and then use a carpenter square to transfer those lines. And once I was happy with how it looked, I cut out the hole using an angle grinder and that same cutting wheel as before. And this is definitely not the most precise way to cut, but it works for this project. And after you set all your tiles, it's a good idea to run a leveler back and forth to make sure that you don't have any lippage between the two tiles. And now that you know how I made those intricate cuts, you might be wondering how I made those half cuts that go against the wall. And for those, I use this super cheap dry tile cutter where you're basically gonna put the tile in between, score the face of the tile where you want to make your cut, and after you score it, you're just going to push down on the handle and snap the tile right across that line. Super simple, no dust, very easy. And at this point, I think you guys have the general process for installing these tiles down to a science, so I think I should address the elephant in the room. 99 times out of 100, you're going to start in the back of the room and you're going to tile your way out of the room. But because the back of my room is going to be covered up by cabinets, I essentially have a get out of jail free card where if there's an issue or I make any kind of mistake, it's going to be covered up. And I want the front of the room to be perfect. So for that reason, I started in the front of the room and I went all the way to the back here and then left myself a little escape path to get out. And the idea is I'm gonna let the tiles dry and then come back and do the remaining tiles the next day. But if you're gonna stop and restart any tile project, make sure that you put your spacers in the night before, because once that mortar dries, you're never getting those in. And 24 hours later, after letting the initial batch of tiles dry, I came in and I started to finish off the back of the room. Now, I know some of you tile professionals are gonna take issue with the approach of starting in the front and ending in the back, but because I had the cabinets in the back and then also along the side of the room, I saw it as an opportunity to hide any imperfections and to also ensure that the front of the room was perfect. So definitely was a little bit lazy, but it made sense for this application, at least to me. And then I simply tiled my way out of the room so that I could walk on the tiles that had 24 hours to dry.
After giving the tile around 24 hours to kind of cure and harden, it's time for the most fun part, followed by the worst part.
The fun part is actually removing the leveling spacers, and to do this, you can either kick them using a boot or just use a rubber mallet.
And you're gonna save these for the next job and throw these away.
Don't even think about using a regular hammer. Do not chip your tiles. It is not worth it. And after sweeping everything up, it's time for the worst part of any tile project, which is cleaning out the grout lines and scraping off any mortar that dried in between the tiles or on top. I like to use this scraping tool for the grout lines, a scrub brush attachment on my drill for the mortar, and you can use an oscillating tool, but be careful. And after cleaning off any excess mortar, it's time to grout our tiles. And unlike the tiles, I started grouting in the back of the room like a sane person. And the process for grouting is super simple. You're just gonna take some grout on a grout float and then apply it to all the grout lines at a 45-degree angle, going in multiple different directions to make sure that you fill the entire grout line. After applying the grout, take your grout float at a 90-degree angle and scrape off all the excess. And you want to remove the majority of the excess grout with your grout float, and any of the remaining grout haze that dries on the top of the tile, you're going to remove with a wet sponge. And sometimes you have to wipe down the face a few times to get all of that grout haze off. And because grout is pervious, and mostly because I'm using a lighter grout, I went in and I sealed all the grout lines using a foam brush. After applying that to all the grout lines, I used a sponge just to clean everything up and for a little bonus sealing on the face of the tiles. And with the tile and grout sealed, the last thing we have to do is wire up the Schluter thermostat. And as you can see, this is the Schluter Ditra Heat smart thermostat. And after removing the face frame, I'm gonna wire up the heating cable leads to the top, and then I'm gonna take my incoming 120 volt power supply and wire that up to the bottom terminals as I'm showing right here. And a quick shout out to Schluter for providing me with the Schluter Ditra Heat system for this install. Super excited to actually test this out in the winter. The temperature sensors are going to get wired up here, and I'll link Schluter's thermostat installation video down below for more details. Now let's get our initial temperature reading, and then let's flip the breaker and crank this thing up.
Now here's a quick reminder look at where this project started, and here is a look at the final result.
Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please drop a like down below. Consider subscribing if you like DIY content. And if you want a cost breakdown for this project, check out my blog. And I also have a free ebook that goes through the entire kitchen remodeling process. Hope to see you next week when we install the cabinets. Thanks.